my childhood sweetheart when we were both 21. We had been a couple from our early teens, and I always thought we'd be together for the rest of our lives. Sadly, this story resulted from the fact that my wife, the love of my life, my soulmate, as I had thought at the time, obviously had a different opinion. We both grew up and lived until we were in our 20s in a typical close-knit small town of about 12,000 inhabitants, about 10 miles or so from one of England's major cities. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. You maybe know the sort of town I mean, where a kid couldn't do anything without his parents finding out from some interfering busybody or other. Any misadventures or slight misdemeanors got back to your parents often before you had even returned home yourself. Because it was off the beaten track slightly, yet also on a main railway line, our town was a very desirable place to live for people wanting to work in the big city but not live there. This led to house prices being way above the norm for the area and caused the problem of young locals getting married and not being able to afford a decent-sized house near their families and the friends they grew up with. That, in itself, created a separate problem, splitting the town between locals and newcomers who viewed living there as a stepping stone to somewhere better. The school we were both attending when we met was one of those large, purpose-built secondary modern establishments that had sprung up around the country in order to cater for the Warbaby Bulge, intended to accommodate kids from several nearby villages. It was cold, impersonal, and full of inter-village rivalries amongst its pupils. Large class sizes meant teachers only seemed to want to bother with kids who were willing to toe the line and do as they were told. Not suited to my inbuilt rebellious streak at all. All in all, I grew up in a claustrophobic and lonely environment for any teenager to be a part of. As I stumbled through my early years with no friends, a family that didn't understand me, and teachers who couldn't give a damn about me. And I hated it. That is, until I met Claire. Claire was always admired for her looks and personality. Slim and naturally energetic, she couldn't help but attract attention. Even as she grew up, her positive energy and friendliness made her someone everyone wanted to be around. Claire's transformation into a confident and popular young woman came naturally to her, and she seemed unaware of the effect she had on people at first. She had a presence that drew others in, not just boys who liked her but also girls who wanted to be like her. What made her truly remarkable was that she managed to avoid the pettiness and jealousy that sometimes accompanied popularity. Her personality was warm and genuine, and this made her universally liked. Everyone, from her peers to her teachers, wanted to be part of her circle. As for me, I always thought I was incredibly fortunate when Claire and I got together. It was strange that we ever connected at all, given how different we were. She was my first girlfriend, and I was completely captivated by her. It felt like a dream when, one cold and crisp autumn day, she approached me while I was sitting alone during lunchtime. At that time, I didn't have any friends, so sitting alone wasn't unusual. But Claire's natural charm put me at ease, and we started talking as if we had known each other for years. Within half an hour, we were holding hands and walking back into school together. I couldn't believe it. Back then, I wasn't anything special. Sure, I was tall, over 6 feet at 14 years old, but otherwise, I was just a typical moody teenager, always at odds with my parents and authority. My rebellious streak often landed me in trouble, leading to detentions and other punishments. Was still allowed in schools back then, or it led to me being grounded forevermore at home by my despairing parents, unfashionably long hair, skinny white body, heavy smoker, underage drinker. I was the archetypal bad boy that for some inexplicable reason some so-called nice girls seemed to be attracted to in my early teens. I was perpetually in trouble inexorably and totally unable to back down in any shape or form. I always seemed to turn a discussion into a disagreement into a full-blown argument, an argument into a fight into a vendetta. You know the sort of insolent youth I mean. You've all met them and wanted to give them a good clip around the ear. No doubt consequently, Claire and I became an item. We were both 15 at the time, and our two sets of parents had totally opposite views on the situation. Understandably, hers were appalled and disgusted. They couldn't for 1 millisecond understand why their beautiful, intelligent daughter should ever want to be seen with someone like me. Her solid conservative father hated me. Her mother, well, she was probably a little frightened of me as well as hating me, although I always had the impression she knew what her daughter was attracted to. My parents, on the other hand, were delighted. They saw the lovely Claire as an influence who would help get my life on track and make me settle down, make me grow up, if you like. I was very much the youngest sibling in my family, having come along as a complete and utter shock to my parents, who were both in their early 40s by the time I arrived on the scene. My father had been fortunate to not have to fight in either of the world wars, too young for the first, too old for the second, he told me. I had one sister who was 22 years older than me, and also a younger one who was just 18 when I was born. The pair of them had been Land Army girls in the Second World War, and had both married ex-servicemen. Both my parents admitted freely over the years that if I hadn't been the son my dad had always wanted, they would probably have been tempted to have me adopted and put the experience behind them, settling for the two girls they loved and adored and could afford. The strangest thing to my young mind, though, was the fact that my eldest sister and her husband had twin girls the year before I was born, resulting in the embarrassing circumstance that I had two nieces who were both a year in front of me at school. Try explaining that to teasing so-called school friends. No wonder I turned into such an introverted, rebellious person back then. Sadly, but probably understandably, I turned out to be such a bitter disappointment as a teenager to all concerned. Claire was an only child. She too was a fairly late arrival. Her mother was almost 30 and her father 33 when she was born. Not particularly old by today's standards, but back then anyway, most couples had started their families much earlier in their lives. Her mother loved her dearly, but her father, her dear old dad, well, it has to be said he absolutely doted on her and spoiled her rotten. A state of affairs that no doubt contributed to the eventual problems in mine and Claire's marriage later on. Despite all her father's attempts to dissuade her, Claire and I became a union that wasn't for breaking. We would meet on every available occasion, and as my parents had hoped, she became a wonderful influence on me. She persuaded me to change my attitude toward life, particularly in school, encouraging me to study and focus on passing my exams. Neither of us were college material, though we weren't lacking in intelligence, but nor were we straight as students. Claire had always seemed destined to work for her father, who owned a few furniture shops spread across the local area, and that's exactly what happened. She started as a trainee after leaving school at 16, and by the time she reached 21, she was managing one of the larger shops in the chain. I too had left school at 16 and, through a friend of my dad, had started an apprenticeship as an auto mechanic with the local Jaguar franchise. It turned out I was actually very good at it, having a natural talent for diagnostics. This was way before it was all done by computers, and I soon became a well-valued and integral part of the workshop. Happy that I had finally got my life on track, both my parents were delighted when I told them I was going to ask Claire to marry me as soon as I graduated as a full-fledged mechanic and started earning a skilled man's wage. Claire's parents, on the other hand, well, let's just say it wasn't the most agreeable night I had ever had when I asked her father if I could take his only daughter as my wife. Actually, he went berserk, threatening to give me a good beating if I didn't get out of his house immediately. As a way of introducing discipline and anger management into my life, my dad had suggested I start taking karate and judo lessons when I was 14. I took to them like a duck to water and had achieved a junior black belt in both disciplines by the time I was 16. The only person at that age in the whole country to reach that standard in both martial arts. Consequently, there would be no way in hell that a middle-aged man would ever have the ability to throw me out of anywhere if I didn't want to go. I was 6 feet 3 inches by that time and had started to develop a lean, muscular, and very strong physique. Claire's dad was only about 5 feet 8 inches or so. Consequently, as he stood in front of me, red-faced and yelling all he could muster, I was looking down at him from a position of dominance as he comically tried to intimidate me. Thankfully, the emotional control I had learned in those intervening years enabled me to calmly do as he demanded, leaving with a promise from Claire's mom, Gwen, that she would talk to him and try to make him see that his daughter and I were in love, and he would surely alienate his little girl if he persisted with his attitude toward me. Gwen miraculously managed to come through with her promise, and Claire and I were married a few months later in front of my delighted parents and siblings, and Claire's scowling but reluctantly agreeable father. Gwen actually shed quite a few tears, gripping me tightly as she hugged me after the ceremony and whispering softly that whatever happened in the future with me and her daughter, I would always be welcome in her house and she hoped we would always be family. If only I had known just how poignant those quiet words would prove to be. It had actually been quite a few years after we first got together that Claire and I had deepened our relationship physically. We were both young and naive back then, not knowing much at all about intimacy other than what we had learned in biology class. For over 3 years, until we were both 18, we gradually escalated our tentative teenage exploration up to the point where we both agreed to take the final step to express our love for each other. As we were both technically inexperienced, I didn't want our first experience together to be anything other than special for the love of. I didn't want the usual backseat of a car or rushing to get it over with before either set of parents discovered us. Instead, I wanted it to be romantic and memorable for her, not something she would ever look back on with regret. Eventually, I saved up enough money to book a lovely room at a small hotel miles away from where we lived. So, under the pretext of spending the night individually at a friend's house, we finally and enthusiastically celebrated our love. After waiting as long as we had, we were both understandably eager to connect with each other. Our mutual excitement quickly dispelled any nerves we may have had, and we began to undress each other tenderly in our softly lit bedroom. Approximately 30 seconds after entering the room, I was struck by how beautiful she was. Her flawless complexion was mesmerizing. We had discussed our plans thoroughly for the evening, and Claire had been on the pill for several weeks beforehand, having obtained them from a family planning clinic in a nearby town, as she didn't trust her family doctor not to inform her parents. With that all in mind, we shared an intimate moment where my darling future wife gazed up at me lovingly, whispering how much she loved me in between kisses. We never made it down to dinner that night. Instead, we spent the evening exploring each other, enjoying our connection. Each time we woke up through the night, we would share tender moments, and eventually, we had to get up and check out of the hotel, laughing as we tossed the messy sheets into the wash basket. On our way out, we bumped into an older couple exiting the room next door. The disapproving look on the After our first night together, we took every opportunity to express our affection anytime and anywhere. While we never seemed to match the excitement and love of that first experience, every moment together was special. We were happy in our marriage at first, although it eventually became clear that I had been much happier than my wife. I had managed to secure a promotion at work, leading to a substantial raise, while Claire's father had increased her salary when we married, probably to make me feel inferior. Despite Claire bringing home more money than I did, I covered the majority of the household expenses, like the mortgage and utilities. I didn't mind. I viewed it as my role as a provider and protector, which is how I had been raised. All of my financial contributions meant that Claire had a great deal of disposable income to spend as she pleased. She willingly took advantage of that, always having trendy designer. Her father also bought her a brand new E-Type convertible as a company car from the dealership where I worked. I was sure he intended to humiliate me in front of my coworkers. To be fair, she also bought me many expensive gifts, a Rolex for my birthday, designer suits, even handmade shirts, all things not usually associated with a foreman mechanic. I, in turn, completely renovated our little cottage, adding an extension and transforming it into a good-sized family home we could be proud of. I first began to notice a change in Claire after we returned from a holiday in Spain. Back then, there weren't the cheap package holidays that are readily available now, so she had paid for it out of her own money. I didn't mind. All my spare cash was going into our home, so if we wanted a holiday, she had to take care of that. We stayed at a rather posh hotel in Barcelona, close to all the vibrant nightlife and beautiful beaches that the city had to offer. We had become friendly with another couple our age that we met in the hotel bar on our first night there. At first, I was okay with them, but after a few days of listening to how much their house in London was worth and how much money they earned in their wonderful jobs, I soon grew bored. I didn't hesitate to tell Claire that I wasn't keen on socializing with them as much as she seemed to want to. I was amazed when she flew off the handle, complaining that I was just a stick in the mud, content to stay where I was without trying to improve our lives like her dad had. I was stunned. Until then, I had no idea that my wife was dissatisfied with our life together. I felt secure in the belief that we were soulmates who wanted all the same things from our marriage, like a lovely home and maybe a couple of kids later on. How wrong I was. It became quite clear after our return home that my lovely bride was not as happy with our lifestyle as I had thought. Raised by her doting father, who provided for her every desire, Claire couldn't understand why we had to save for anything. If she wanted something, she wanted it immediately, not in a few months or years when we could afford it. Her father didn't help. He would still buy her anything she asked for, even though that responsibility should have been mine once we were married. I had firmly refused his offer to buy us a brand new house on a desirable estate development, insisting that we should manage on our own. Instead, I reluctantly agreed to accept his help with the deposit on our first home, but only if we had a mortgage we could afford on my income alone. Of course, Claire's salary, working for her father, was much higher than that of a humble car mechanic, and he made sure I was aware of it. He would take every opportunity to undermine my relationship with Claire, trying to split us up even though I thought we were happily married. This dynamic led to resentment on my part and increasingly vocal arguments between my wife and me. Frustrated by our constant bickering, I threw myself into my martial arts training, attending classes 4 or 5 times a week, either at the gym or running through the country lanes surrounding our town. Inevitably, this created a growing rift between Claire and me. She started going out with her single friends while I was training during the week, only spending time with me on weekends when we would go to nice restaurants or clubs. Despite leading fairly separate social lives, our home life was still good. In between the petty arguments, we laughed a lot and communicated openly. However, I never suspected that our marriage was in deep trouble, until that day, the day that changed everything and ultimately destroyed my life. Looking back now, I remember every second of that horrible day. I had arranged to pick up a customer's car for service, which required driving past our house. Since I always left home before Claire and before the post arrived, I thought I would stop by for a cup of coffee while checking for an important letter I had been waiting for. If only I had been more patient, my life could have taken a different turn. I let myself in, picked up the mail, and went to the kitchen to put on the coffee machine. I preferred proper coffee over the instant variety we drank at work. Noticing the message waiting light flashing on the answering machine my wife thought we desperately needed, I flicked the switch while looking through the mail. It took a few seconds before I realized it was playing back a conversation that involved my wife and a man's voice I didn't recognize at all. It appeared, as I found out later, that if you picked up the phone at the exact moment the answering machine, I stopped the replay and started it from the beginning again, wondering if it was something important. Hello? Hi. Hello, how are you? Great. Just ringing to thank you for last night. It was wonderful, she chuckled. Oh yes, I thought it was great too. I've never done that before. I always thought it was only for others. I never knew it would feel so amazing. I love it. I always have. It's so thrilling. Do you do that with your husband? Oh my God, no. He'd never want to do anything like that. Just the same old routine? That's him. That invited more chuckling from both of them. I know. I'm getting excited just thinking about it, although I am still a little sore. We'll have to do it again the next time we meet. More laughter from my wife. Was I right? Is it the best you've ever had then? Maybe. Maybe not. That's my little secret. Anyway, I have to get off to work. Will you be there next week? Oh yes, I want more of you. Well, I'll have to see if I get a better offer. See you soon. Bye. That was followed by a kiss. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. I dropped my coffee cup and slumped to the floor with my back against the wall, shaking with shock and disbelief. What had I just heard? My wife? No, it couldn't be, could it? Not the love of my life, surely. I stood again, tottering slightly, as I pressed the play message button once more. I listened again to my wife's conversation with the stranger. Was it a joke? No, of course not. She had no idea she was being recorded. I replayed the recording, paying careful attention to what had been said. What did she mean by the same old routine? I was 6 feet 3 inches and much more than adequately built. How could she possibly be dissatisfied? Our intimate life was great. We occasionally had a quick encounter, but more often than not, we would spend ages connecting until we were both satisfied. Or so. Now she was discussing being with a man who wasn't me and how much she enjoyed it. I've always loved it, she had said. It wasn't her first time. How many other men had she allowed into her life that she had denied me, her loving husband? We'll have to do it again the next time we meet. How long had this affair been going on? See you next week. She clearly intended for it to continue unless she got a better offer. Was this a regular thing? Did she see other men besides him? My mind was in turmoil, filled with so many thoughts and images. Up until then, I had thought I had a wonderful, happy marriage, admittedly with a few ups and downs along the way, but no more than any other couple. Now I discovered that my beautiful wife had been unfaithful. I then cleaned up the mess from the kitchen floor and once again listened to the tape. I was still sitting there, my inner rage hardly diminished when my wife arrived home from work several hours later. "Hi, sweetheart," she said happily as she bent to kiss my cheek when she found me in the kitchen. I glared back at her, breathing deeply as I tried to keep my temper in check. "Who is he?" I asked quietly. "Who's who, darling?" she replied, going to the fridge and getting a can of Diet Coke. "Who the hell is he? You're cheating." This time she stopped, still facing away from me, her shoulders slumping. I pressed the play button once more. Once again, the sounds of their voices filled the room. I just managed to hear a murmured, "Oh, hell," as she turned toward me, her face looking anxiously toward the tape machine. "I won't ask you again. Who the hell is he?" I demanded. Taking a deep breath and pulling herself up to her full height, she said firmly, "I don't need this in my life." With that, she turned and left the kitchen, leaving me to glare after her. Seconds later, I heard the front door slam, followed by the sound of her car engine starting and the wheels screeching as she sped away at maximum speed. I never heard from her again. I tried to get in touch with her, especially when I was served with the divorce papers citing my alleged mental cruelty as the reason for her leaving me. Her father's idea, no doubt. Every time I tried to ring her at her parents' house, I was informed by her father that I was no longer part of his daughter's life, and to keep away from his family or else. After several failed attempts to reach her, I was eventually served with a restraining order preventing me from trying to contact her or her family again, and not allowing me within 500 yards of them, as they feared for their safety because of my martial arts skills and my well-known temper. That was all nonsense, of course. There was no way I would have physically harmed her. I just wanted to find out what had happened that caused her to no longer love me. Her father was a different matter. I would gladly have confronted that interfering man. After she had stormed out of the house, I rang work and explained to my boss that I needed some time off urgently. He was not happy, complaining that we were far too busy for me to suddenly take a holiday. Eventually, he reluctantly agreed, but only after I threatened to leave completely if he didn't. I told him I had personal matters to attend to, and that I'd be back at work in about 2 weeks. The majority of that downtime was spent moping around the house and feeling sorry for myself as I continuously wondered what the hell had happened. I tried to ring my in-laws and, I'm sorry to say, drank alone until I passed toward the end of my self-imposed solitude. I heard the doorbell ring early one evening. I was sitting in the TV room with a nearly empty bottle of scotch in one hand and the TV remote in the other. I wasn't really watching the inane rubbish that was on the large TV my dear wife had insisted we buy, as I drunkenly cursed her, her father, and everyone else who knew her, hoping against hope that it was my wife returning to me so she could explain it had all been a mistake and she still loved me dearly. I staggered to the door and opened it to find not my wife, but my mother-in-law. "Oh my God, John, look at the state of you," she exclaimed, her face showing her shock as she pushed past me into the hallway and slammed the door behind her. "Good grief, son. You look a right mess. What the hell do you want, and where's my wife?" I snapped, obviously shocking her with my foul-mouthed drunkenness. "There's no need for that sort of language. It's not like you at all," my mother-in-law replied sternly. "Sorry," I mumbled, suitably chastened by the woman I had always liked and admired. "I just want to know where she is so we can sort all this out." Sitting down in a fireside chair, she suddenly burst into tears. "Oh, John, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's come over her. I had no idea anything was wrong, why she felt she needed to leave you. I'm so sorry, but it appears she's adamant that your marriage is over and she wants a divorce. She's gone away on a holiday somewhere. I'm so sorry. I really am," she sobbed. "Hey, it's not your fault," I replied as I sat on the chair arm and put my arm around her. "There's no need for you to get so upset." Leaning her head on my arm, she answered, "Oh, I don't know. Perhaps if I had been stronger when she was growing up and not let her father spoil her, perhaps she would have appreciated more what a good man she had. Maybe not been so keen to have everything her own way. Is that what it was? Did I not give her everything she wanted? Bloody hell, I don't know what more I could have done. I thought she was happy. She never mentioned she wasn't. Never, I replied. I know you did, sweetheart. Compared with what I have, you are a brilliant husband. She's just so foolish. Wow, I had never heard that lovely, mature lady use any sort of swearing before. Certainly not the F word. I was shocked, but for some strange reason, I started laughing as I hugged her close. There's no need to swear, you know, I laughed, mocking her previous admonishment of me for doing the same thing. Oh, screw off, she laughed back, wiping her tears from her cheeks. By the way, you absolutely stink. I did as ordered, standing under the hot water until it ran cold and staying there until I was shivering in an attempt to sober up quickly. It worked, sort of. About an hour later, I walked back downstairs, clean and dressed in fresh clothes for the first time in days. I still had a slight buzz, but also the makings of a monumental headache starting in my throbbing brain. I found Gwen in the freshly tidied kitchen holding a mug of coffee as she sat at the breakfast bar. Here, you look as though you need this more than I do, she smirked as she passed the steaming mug to my trembling hands. Have you had anything to eat other than the other half of the pizza that was upside down on the living room carpet? Trying to remember, I replied. I don't think so. I haven't been in the mood. That won't do you any good. Now go sit down while I make you something, she ordered. Pushing me back out of my kitchen, I noticed the slightly sickly smell of freshly sprayed deodorant as I sat on the sofa, drinking the strong black liquid. My headache was getting progressively worse as I continued to sober up, causing me to feel ill. I couldn't help myself. I needed to throw up if I was going to feel better. I went to the downstairs loo, and after pushing a couple of fingers down my throat, I deposited the unpleasant contents of my stomach down the pan. Feel better now? Gwen asked as I returned to the living room to find her sitting back in the chair. Think you can keep that down? She asked, pointing to the bowl of chicken soup and noodles on the coffee table. I nodded, smiling embarrassedly, just happy that the movement no longer made me feel sick. I can only try. Thank you. Okay, I'll get off now. Come round to our house tomorrow lunchtime, and I'll make you a proper meal. You don't have to do that. I can manage, I protested. Maybe I don't, but I want to. Okay, I replied. What about Frank, though? Oh, he'll be at work until after 8 p.m., so there's no need to worry about that old so-and-so. She laughed as she put her coat back on and made her way to the front door. Now eat that soup, get yourself to bed, and we'll have a good chat tomorrow. After a good 12 hours of sleep, I was finally feeling better when I pulled into my in-laws' drive the following day, exactly as I had been ordered to. G opened the door before I had the chance to ring the bell and pulled me inside. I'm so glad you decided to come, she said as she walked in front of me toward the living room. I got the impression I didn't really have a choice. I laughed in return as I followed my mother-in-law down the hallway. I noticed for the first time how short and fitted the skirt she was wearing was, much more stylish than her normal attire. Puzzled, I followed her into the room and sat opposite her as requested. Now that I could see her upper body properly, I was pleasantly surprised to notice how her blouse was much more tailored than she would normally wear. Her face was made up carefully too, and her hair, normally tied in a ponytail, was brushed out and flowing down to her shoulders. She smiled nervously as she caught me glancing at her. Leaning back into her sofa, she crossed her legs, inadvertently drawing my attention. I felt myself blushing. I had never had any inappropriate feelings toward my mother-in-law. Well, not that I would admit anyway. But there I was, staring openly at her, feeling a mix of confusion and unexpected warmth. She lowered her eyes from mine nervously, pulling at her shoulder-length hair. I listened to that message yesterday when you were upstairs having a shower. I'm so sorry, John. I really am. I'm thoroughly ashamed of my daughter. How could she do that to you? How could she do those things with another man? Embarrassed, I grimaced at her. I don't know, Gwen. I thought she was happy. I did too, she replied, stern-faced. She always was a willful girl, but I don't know what the hell has come over her. I again grinned in shocked surprise as she once more used language I was not used to hearing from her. Oops, sorry. I know I shouldn't swear. She's just made me so mad, she went on, her face reddening with embarrassment. We burst into laughter, grinning at each other as we both relaxed a little. I again glanced down at her legs, marveling at how much she looked like a more mature version of her daughter, and flushing again as she caught me looking. Do you like what you see, John? The clothes are Claire's. I thought you would appreciate seeing them again, she said softly as she recrossed her legs, causing her skirt to slide a little farther up her thighs. Gwen? I queried, raising my eyebrows in astonishment at the confident woman in front of me, a side of her I had never suspected existed. Her voice trembling with obvious nerves, she continued, Please don't turn me down, John. I know I'm not as young or firm as my daughter, but I fancied you since the first time I met you. Now that she has abandoned you, I was wondering, oh my God, Gwen, I had no idea. I've never felt about you that way. The look of disappointment that crossed her face was obvious as she lowered her eyes. Suddenly, she smiled. Well, it certainly looks as though you feel that way now, she chuckled, glancing at my jeans. I followed her gaze and realized my jeans were fitting quite snugly. Blushing furiously, I grabbed a magazine and covered myself, trying to hide my embarrassment from my mother-in-law. With more confidence in her voice now, she spoke softly. We can either put this conversation behind us and eat the lunch I've prepared, or we can go upstairs and take our time, and then eat later. Taking my bemused silence as a yes to the latter, my previously reserved mother-in-law stood and took my hand, pulling me to my feet in one smooth movement. Reaching up, she drew my head down toward hers and kissed me, surprising me with the intensity of her kiss. I responded instinctively. It had been over a month since I had any intimate contact, and my body reacted naturally to her warm embrace. Taking my hand, she led me upstairs to the master bedroom, clearly hoping her advances would lead to more. The curtains were drawn, the room was lit by several candles flickering dimly, the heating was turned up, and a pristine white satin sheet covered the bed, ready for our interaction. Afterward, as I sat and pulled my knees up to my chest, I asked, You know you are only the second woman I've been with, right? Really? Wow, I had no idea. I always thought you would have been with a lot of people before you met Claire, Gwen answered, joining me and leaning against the headboard. You mean you were a virgin when you first got together with my daughter? We both were, I replied wistfully, glancing at the photo of my estranged wife on the bedside table. I can't believe she thinks she can find someone better. She should think herself lucky. She's not married to her father because he is useless at it. Gwen laughed as she playfully punched my shoulder before jumping out of bed and strolling into the en-suite. She returned a few seconds later and joined me on the bed again. I suppose we had better get out of bed and clean up then, I said. Oh, I don't know. Perhaps I'll just leave it for him to sleep in. I don't think he'd notice. He certainly wouldn't recognize the smell of anything anyway, she chuckled mischievously. We showered together, and afterward, I put my jeans and shirt back on while she slipped into a pink tracksuit. We left the bedroom and went back downstairs. Oh yes, I'm starving, I exclaimed as I spied the sandwiches and snacks she had prepared for our delightfully postponed lunch. You won't have time. You'll have to get a takeaway on the way home while I tidy up. Frank can have the food when he gets home. You've had his wife all afternoon, so he may as well have your lunch. My mother-in-law joked as she pushed me out the door, not before we exchanged another kiss on her front doorstep. My relationship with my mother-in-law continued for the next few months as I came to accept that my marriage was over. We met whenever we could. Sometimes she would come over to my house, and we would spend hours together. The best times were always when we spent time in her marital bed, which felt like a secret adventure. On my father's advice, I employed the services of a lawyer friend of his as my divorce attorney. Just as well, really, as I found out later that Claire was suing me for alimony and 50% of all our assets. I had always thought she would have more than me to divide up, but my lawyer discovered that according to her father's records, she had only ever been paid a pittance compared to what I had been led to believe. She had no savings whatsoever, and her car was leased by her father's company. Consequently, She demanded we sell the house and divide the proceeds 50-50, even though all the work and expense put into it had been mine. Because of the extensions and renovations, our home was worth several times more than we owed on it, so she would be due a considerable lump sum, much more than I would receive, as I would be responsible for all her expenses concerning the house sale and ensuing divorce. My lawyer fought tooth and nail, at a great expense, to get the settlement down. We countersued her because of her behavior, only to be shot down by her aggressive lawyer, who persuaded the judge that I had driven her to have affairs through my mental cruelty and neglect of her feelings. Even though the judge was obviously skeptical, I still had to sell the house and pay her legal expenses, although he did decide I should not have to pay alimony. I'm convinced he knew that she and her father were not being truthful about her salary during our time together. Inevitably, by the time everything was sorted out and paid, I was left with just a few £1,000s to show for all the work I had done on the house and all the time and effort I had put into our marriage. I now had nowhere to live and still had no idea why she had done what she did. A few months after our divorce was finalized, I had moved to the city and was living in a small 2-bedroom flat that I was renting. It was okay, I suppose, just nowhere near as comfortable as our old house had been. My relationship with my ex-mother-in-law continued as we took advantage of opportunities for her to go to the city shopping. Instead of shopping, we would spend the afternoon and evening together. I know some of you might think of me as a hypocrite for being involved with another man's wife while condemning my own for her actions, but all I can say in my defense is that my father-in-law deserved it for being so unpleasant toward me for as long as he had known me. I had had no contact whatsoever with Claire since we left the divorce court. Not a word, nothing. It appeared she had moved to the city and was living in a penthouse flat she had purchased with the divorce settlement, with help from her father, in a far more upscale area than the one I was living in. There was little chance of our paths ever crossing. She had virtually severed all contact with her mother. Gwen told me they had several major arguments as a family over Claire's treatment of me. Claire and her father were on one side, while Gwen stood alone fighting my corner. Eventually, Claire snapped at her mother, telling her to mind her own business and to keep her interfering nose out of her life. Inevitably, the atmosphere in her parents' house became unbearable whenever Claire visited, and eventually, she stopped going. Her father started visiting her at her flat whenever they wanted to see one another. Gwen just gave up on her daughter, ignoring her husband whenever he brought up anything that had been going on in Claire's life in an attempt to avoid any further arguments about his little girl. She and I settled into an unspoken agreement. We would never discuss my ex-wife whenever we were together. That suited me down to the ground. I didn't really want anything to do with the situation, so not mentioning her was perfect for me. I have to admit I was full of resentment toward my ex-wife. The lies she told during our divorce, the way she betrayed my love for her, and the fact that she never offered an explanation about why she had become dissatisfied with our life together contributed greatly to my feelings. What hurt the most, perhaps, was the look of contemptuous disinterest she gave me when we left the court after our divorce was granted. 10 years together as a couple, and it obviously meant nothing to her. Sometime after our split, I discovered through a friend of one of my nieces that months before our separation and divorce, Claire had started going to a well-known club in the city, a place where married women were known to go when looking for relationships with unknown men. She had been seen there quite a few times while we were still supposedly together, usually with different men. Toward the end of our marriage, she always appeared to be with the same man, who was reputedly quite a bit older than my wife, wealthy, flashy, and known for having a reputation for a more questionable lifestyle. This information, of course, added to my sense of despair and anger about my marriage, further fanning the flames of the burning feelings of betrayal and hatred I had toward the former love of my life. She obviously wanted something completely different from what she was getting from me, something she felt she needed other men for. I still didn't understand what that something was, though. The following summer, I reluctantly agreed to join my work colleagues on a night out to celebrate the 21st birthday of one of them. They had arranged to go on a pub crawl around the city and then finish the night off at a nightclub, hoping to meet some women. I agreed to go on the pub crawl but stated that I would skip the nightclub, as I already had someone whenever I wanted and didn't need to approach any women to find companionship. Much to my surprise, I actually quite enjoyed my night out drinking with my workmates and left them as they began to make their way into the club, feeling slightly amused as they all set off on their drunken stagger. I had a bit of a buzz going myself as I left them at the door and set off in search of a kebab, as is the tradition for all drunken men in the UK. As I walked happily down the street, singing to myself, a car door suddenly swung open as I was passing, banging against my hip and causing the door to rebound back, apparently trapping the driver's foot. Well, oops, sorry, mate. I apologized. Watch where you're going, you idiot, came the reply as the door burst open again, and a short, stocky middle-aged man stood up to confront me. My fault, no problem. I again apologized, not wanting any trouble. Leave him alone, Carl. He's always been a damn fool. A female voice I instantly recognized rang out from the other side of the car. A.B. Bentley, I noticed for the first time. You know this fool? Carl demanded of her. He's my ex-husband, Claire replied, the disgust in her voice quite obvious even to my drunken brain. Is he really? Well, it's about time he learned a lesson, the man spat, pushing me in the chest and sending me staggering against a shop window. My training and self-defense instincts subconsciously kicked in, and I pushed him forcefully back against his car, hearing a satisfying grunt as he slumped to the floor. So much for teaching me a lesson. I snapped at my furious ex-wife as she ran around to the driver's side of the car, and I set off on my way again, her angry voice ringing in my ears as I walked away, mumbling a few hundred expletives about her and her new partner. I forgot about my kebab and flagged a taxi down, making my way home, where I collapsed onto my bed without even getting undressed and immediately fell asleep. The following morning, I awoke to the sound of loud banging in my head. I slowly realized through my emerging consciousness that it wasn't a brain hemorrhage or even just a hangover, but instead was some idiot pounding violently on the front door of my flat. Moments later, I was confronted by a gang of uniformed police staring down at me as I lay on top of my bed in a semi-conscious haze. John Grant, are you John Grant? I dimly heard a man in plain clothes address me from the doorway. I nodded, unable to speak properly due to the fuzz that seemed to have grown on my tongue overnight. John Grant, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Carl Simpson. You do not have to say anything, but whatever you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence against you. Do you understand? My head was scrambled. Who the hell was Carl Simpson? Murder? What the hell was going on? What the hell are you talking about? I finally managed to get out. I felt myself being dragged to my feet by two burly officers, my arms roughly pulled behind my back as my wrists were secured in steel handcuffs. Take him to the station, the voice said, and be careful with him. He's a dangerous man. What the hell is going on? Dangerous man? Who's a dangerous man? I demanded as I was dragged down the stairs and pushed unceremoniously into the waiting police car, much to the obvious astonishment of my watching neighbors, who had been disturbed by all the noise. I was taken to the local police station, where I was formally charged, and my possessions, including my belt and shoelaces, were confiscated before being placed in a cell with the door locked behind me. Shaking my head in disbelief as I massaged my sore wrists, I tried to make sense of what all this was about. Slowly, my befuddled brain began to clear, and the memory of the previous night gradually came back. Carl. Wasn't that what Claire had called the man who had pushed me? Claire was screaming something at me as I walked away from them. It all started coming back. Oh hell, I thought to myself as I put my head in my hands and sat down heavily on the plastic-covered bench. How the hell had this happened? I hadn't hit anyone, had I? So how could I have murdered someone? The police were not very forthcoming either. They tried to interview me alone at first, pressuring me to confess and make it easier on myself. At least I was alert enough to realize I desperately needed a lawyer and refused to answer any questions until I had one. Eventually, the police left me alone in my cell to wait. There was no way my family or I would have the resources to pay for a fancy defense lawyer, so I was appointed a legal aid solicitor to act as my defender. Luckily, he wasn't just a wet-behind-the-ears newcomer, but a seasoned professional who refused to let me be interviewed until he had found out all the facts, leaving me alone while he went to gather information about the charges. When he returned about an hour later, the expression on his face was enough to tell me I was in deep trouble. It appeared that Carl Simpson had, during our alleged confrontation, banged the back of his head violently against the corner of his car door, causing a massive bleed at the rear of his brain. The accidental blow had knocked him unconscious and eventually killed him before any help had arrived. Hell, I only pushed him. I protested to my freshly appointed lawyer. That's not what the police have been told, he replied, a note of disbelief quite obvious in his tone. They have a witness who says you caused it all. A witness? I just pushed him slightly, just the once. I protested, feeling sick to my stomach from a combination of the trouble I was obviously in and the raging headache from the previous night's drinking that was pounding in my brain. His companion, the woman who was with him, alleges that you attacked him without provocation. He stared into my eyes over the top of his glasses, looking for a clue as to whether I was telling the truth or not. Are you saying she is lying? He demanded. Lying? Of course she's lying. I yelled. She's my ex-wife. She lies about me all the time. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh dear, he said. And I thought it was just going to be a simple drunken brawl that resulted in a tragic accidental death. His words echoed through my befuddled brain as the seriousness of the accusation against me resonated in my confused mind. My ex-wife. I should have known she was the cause of all this. My stomach couldn't take any more. I couldn't hold back any longer. I violently threw up the contents of my churning stomach all over the cell floor. What made me absolutely realize I was in over my head, even more so than anything my solicitor tried to tell me, was when I received a letter from Gwen while I was on remand awaiting my trial. In it, she told me she would be unable to ever forgive her husband and daughter for what they had done to me, and that she would be seeking a divorce from him as soon as she could. She mentioned that she had been to the police and tried to tell them that her daughter's statement about me ever being violent toward her was just a pack of lies and that I had never, in any way, threatened or intimidated my wife during our time together. Sadly, the police had refused to believe her. They informed her that everything she had told them was only hearsay and would be inadmissible as evidence at my trial. They went on to admonish her and tried to make her feel ashamed, telling her that maybe she should be supporting her daughter rather than defending someone who was, after all, only related to her by marriage. Gwen finished the letter by saying she did, in fact, feel ashamed of her daughter and husband. She then apologized for not coming to see me. She felt she wouldn't be able to hold herself together if she ever saw me locked up. She also confirmed she would not be at my trial either. Watching her daughter do her best to get me convicted while her husband gloated was something she just wouldn't have the stomach for. That letter broke my heart. Looking back now, I realize I never stood a chance at my trial, not after my tearful, distraught ex-wife testified. What I really mean is that she lied through her teeth. She stood up in front of all my family, the judge, the jury, and the press and lied from start to finish. She told them she had always been frightened of my aggressive nature and had always worried whenever we had an argument. That was why we had divorced. She never mentioned the fact she had been involved with someone else. She went on to say that I had obviously been drunk when I came across her and her boyfriend that fateful night, shouting at both of them as I went to confront him. He, of course, had been totally innocent. He had asked me politely to leave them alone and to stop swearing at his girlfriend. She described him as a calm man who wouldn't harm a fly, complete and utter nonsense. My lawyer tried his best to convince the jury of my side of the story. Unfortunately, confronted by the sight of that manipulative liar, the 12 good men and women chose to believe her and found me guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The judge was a different matter entirely. He had completely fallen under the spell of the beautiful, distraught woman in the witness box, convinced by her that once again, I had ruined her life by taking away her one true love. In his sentencing statement, he addressed the watching press, telling them he was determined to make an example of me, someone who had used his considerable martial arts skills to cause the death of a significantly older man just because he was with my ex-wife. He went on to say that because of my expertise, my hands and feet could be classified as deadly weapons in the eyes of the law, and the sentence should be the same as if I had attacked the poor victim with a knife or even a gun. Consequently, he felt he had no choice but to sentence me to the most severe punishment possible under the law, stating that I would serve 20 to 30 years in prison with a minimum sentence of 20 years. My poor mother collapsed, sobbing her heart out as she hugged my father in the public gallery. My dad, my strong rock of a father, had tears streaming down his face, a display of raw emotion I had never witnessed from him before. Both my sisters sobbed quietly as they hugged one another. All the while my ex-wife glared unblinkingly at me, a look of vengeful hatred on her face. I was led from the dock to begin the end of my life, as I had known it up to that point. That look, that expression of hate, would stay with me for the rest of my days. It would turn my previous adoration of the woman into an obsessive, reciprocal hatred for the one-time love of my life, who had now ruined me completely. She ended my hopes of ever finding love again and my dreams of having children and a family of my own. I had been a nice man. I was always loving and attentive once I had grown out of my teenage angst. That moment, when I was led away from my sobbing family under the hateful glare of my ex-wife, changed me completely. It made me bitter and resentful. I hated her. I hated the law. I hated myself, and I hated the whole world. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I was terrified when I was first locked up in my cell at a high-security prison somewhere in the wilds of the West Country. I had never been incarcerated anywhere before. I had heard the rumors and knew what happened to people like me in jail. I knew I could look after myself if I had to, but if I was ganged up on, who knew what would happen? On my first day in there, I met a man who would remain a friend until his death a few years ago, a habitual criminal named Archie Rebrand Squires. He was just a few years older than me, and I was to share a cell with him. I suppose you could say he took me under his wing, explaining all the do's and don'ts and who was who in the prison. He informed me he was the best forger in the country and was only locked up because he had been reported by someone to whom he'd sold a forged work of art, who then tried to sell it at an auction. Archie was a right laugh. He was relatively small in stature, delicate, even, but also 100% heterosexual. He was just a really great bloke who happened to be serving 8 years for making money out of his hobby. He became my best friend when I intervened in an argument one day. When I got back to our cell, a big bullying thug was threatening him over his cigarette allowance, demanding that he hand them over or face severe consequences. I made it quite clear that that kind of behavior toward my cellmate wouldn't be tolerated, and a swift kick to the man's groin helped him understand the situation. From then on, Archie was my mate, watching my back and keeping me informed about what was happening in the prison that I should know about. Prisons are not quiet places. All night long, someone is either coughing and sneezing or singing to try to forget where they are, or, in many cases, crying themselves to sleep. The guards are not quiet either. Even if they wore rubber-soled boots, they would have their bunches of keys jangling on their belts as they walked the balconies during their constant nighttime patrols. Consequently, sleep is very difficult in prisons, especially when you're locked up for the first time in your life. I was no exception. For weeks, I suffered from insomnia, laying awake at night totally unable to sleep. Archie would stay awake with me, talking about anything and everything under the sun as he tried to distract me from the nightmare that my life had become. I told him the truth about how I had come to be there. He believed me, the only person I felt ever truly believed my version of events. In return, he told me all about himself. How he was an orphan, never knew either of his parents or anything about them, never even knew his real name. He had been called Archie Squires after the man who had found him and handed him over to the police when he was an abandoned baby. As a baby and then a young child, Archie had been brought up in several Barnardo's orphanages, moving around the country during the war, never settling and never making friends he could call mates. He never even knew when his birthday was. Someone had told him his age once, but they were unable to confirm his date of birth, so he picked the 21st of June as his birthday, the longest day of the year, wanting his birthday to last as long as possible. Gradually, with Archie's help, I managed to start sleeping at night as I became more accustomed to my environment. It was through Archie that I found out in advance that some sort of attack on me was being planned in retaliation for what I'd done to Carl Simpson. It turned out the man I'd accidentally killed was a small-time lowlife who, unfortunately, was related to one of the main drug gangs in the city where I lived. I don't know if my ex-wife was involved in drugs or whether she was with him because of his money and bad boy reputation. Either way, it appeared I had deprived her of her meal ticket, which possibly explained her hatred of me at my trial. Maybe it even went some way to explain why she lied in court as she did. Revenge for what she felt she had lost, I suppose. Archie pointed out that I would have to defend myself wholeheartedly when the attack came. I wouldn't be able to plead with whoever came after me. They wouldn't listen if I tried to talk them out of it, the way my martial arts training had taught me to do. It would be me or them, no half measures. If I didn't finish them, they would finish me. A few days later, several weeks into my sentence, the attack came. My path was blocked as I was leaving the shower block by two huge men as tall as my 6 feet 4 inches frame but much wider, along with another shorter man who looked as mean as a starving Rottweiler. The two big guys circled either side of me while the intimidating man blocked my path and pulled out a homemade shiv from his sleeve, a knife fashioned from a shard of glass. Weapons like that are much more dangerous than ordinary knives. The intention is that they are stuck into the victim and then snapped off so that even if the medics arrive before the victim dies, the glass is almost impossible to extract before they bleed to death internally. I knew instantly that I was not meant to walk out of there. The guards had conveniently disappeared, leaving me to my fate, indifferent to what was about to occur. It would just mean one less villain for them to manage. My 3 intended assailants were certainly trying their best to frighten and intimidate me, describing in detail what they planned to do. Their confidence in their numerical advantage had turned into blind arrogance as they surrounded me, blocking any means of escape. While the adrenaline surged through my body, making me a very nervous target, I had a couple of things in my favor. Firstly, they had no idea of my defensive capabilities as a trained fighter. The fear for my life heightened my focus and strength, sharpening my senses. Secondly, and most importantly, I was fighting for my life while they were simply doing a job. Archie's words echoed in my mind as we squared off, "It's you or them." With that thought, all ideas of avoiding a fight vanished. The man to my right was taken out with a swift kick that dislocated his knee, leaving him writhing on the floor. The one on the left received a powerful roundhouse kick to the face, breaking his nose and several teeth, causing him to sit back dazed. The remaining assailant was less confident after seeing his friends incapacitated so quickly, but he still had the advantage of a weapon. All those hours of martial arts training kicked in as I spun and landed a backward kick to his head, causing him to drop his weapon and fall to his knees, clutching his jaw in pain. I could have walked away, leaving them to suffer, but Archie's warning returned to me. I had to finish it. I jumped behind the man whose weapon was now useless on the floor as he held his injured face. Grabbing him around the neck, I hesitated for only a moment before exerting all my strength, releasing my pent-up anger and despair. His body went limp, and I stood, glaring at the other two without blinking. I made it clear that whoever had ordered this should come for me themselves if they wanted to finish the job. With that, I calmly walked out of the shower block and returned to my cell, ready to face whatever would come next. In prison, the worst thing anyone could do is betray a fellow inmate. It ranks up there with the most serious offenses in the eyes of the true criminal fraternity. Consequently, when my assailants were discovered by the guards, the 2 survivors claimed they had all slipped on soap and collided with each other. Rumors spread quickly, and everyone in the jail claimed to know what had really happened in the shower block that day. Archie knew the truth, but, I was sure, never revealed it. What it did mean was that I was treated with newfound fear, even respect, by the rest of the prison community, who gave me a wide berth whenever I was out of my cell. Of course, a major inquiry into the incident by the police followed, but they never uncovered anything substantial, relying only on the accounts of the injured men, who repeatedly denied any wrongdoing. Eventually, the investigating officers settled for the idea that a dangerous and violent individual was no longer part of the judicial system, saving taxpayers a considerable amount by not having to keep him incarcerated for the rest of his sentence. The prison hierarchy was another matter entirely. I don't mean the governor or the prison officers, but rather the men who truly ran things behind the scenes. Every prison has someone like this. Someone the rest of the inmates fear. Someone who oversees every little scam. Even the guards know who is really in charge and go along with it for their own safety. Our main figure was a psychopathic criminal named Billy McVeigh, a London gangster reputed to have an IQ of over 160. He was the oldest of 3 brothers who supposedly ran the largest and most ruthless crime syndicate in the country, involved in everything from drugs to protection rackets. This made him number 1 on the police's most wanted list before they finally caught him. As the boss of one of the nation's biggest crime gangs, he had been nearly untouchable, with the fear of severe reprisals preventing anyone from testifying against him. Ultimately, he was convicted of several counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with no chance of parole for 30 years, the maximum punishment allowed in the UK at that time. Anyone who received that sentence was considered a master criminal by the press and judiciary. More importantly, the other inmates treated him with the fear and respect that such a reputation commanded. I began to understand the reality of my situation, struggling to articulate my thoughts. What if I don't want to? What if I just want to serve my time and live a quiet life here? I managed to voice my concerns, trying not to sound too terrified. Not fooled by my bravado, McVeigh smiled coldly and replied, "Not going to happen, John. If you refuse, your family will face consequences. I know where they all live. I can provide their addresses if you'd like. We both know you can take care of yourself, but you'll have to sleep sometime. Do we understand one another?" His chilling threat, though softly spoken, was undeniably real. It was a promise from a cold-blooded killer that if I didn't follow his instructions, the consequences for my family would be dire. I knew what had happened to the relatives of others who had crossed him. If I turned down his offer, I would live long enough to hear about the tragedies befalling my family before I died in my cell. Anger welled up inside me at the terrifying prospect for my family. Anger at the psycho in front of me, at my ex-wife for causing the disaster my life had become, and at myself. Inevitably, my path became clear. I had already killed 2 men, one accidentally and the other deliberately. There was no way I could still consider myself morally superior in that hellhole. I couldn't think of a valid reason not to agree. I would be there for at least the next 20 years, so why not make the best of it? I slowly rose to my feet, extending my hand to my new boss. "I understand, Mr. McVeigh. You have a new employee. Glad to hear it, John. Now go back to your cell, and I'll be in touch when you're needed. Although, I imagine once the word is out that you work for me, your expertise won't be needed too often." He shook my hand, revealing a smile that did not reach his eyes, which continued to stare right into my soul. He was right. I wasn't needed as an enforcer too often. Like all rumors, the story of my victory over the 3 attackers was exaggerated, with many details sounding increasingly ridiculous as they spread. The 2 injured men were transferred to other prisons as soon as they were able, leaving me as the only witness to the truth. As Billy had suggested, it was in our interest to maintain the myth. At his suggestion, I began training in the exercise yard while it was crowded with other inmates. This showcased my skills and helped solidify my reputation as a formidable figure. Further into my sentence, the first Lethal Weapon film would be released, and I would be nicknamed Riggs, after the Mel Gibson character. A name that would stick with me for the rest of my time in prison, passed on through generations of new arrivals. It turned out that the 3 men who had attacked me were working at the request of the drug gang that Carl Simpson had belonged to. Fortunately, once they discovered I was working for Billy, they made no further attempts to harm me, and I was largely untroubled for the next few years. Working for Billy had its advantages. The guards left me alone, and the other inmates avoided me, except for Archie. My meals in the canteen were always better and more plentiful than what my fellow prisoners received, and I enjoyed an unlimited supply of soft toilet paper, something that was actually used as currency by some of the lesser inmates. However, I faced the same problem as all long-term prison inmates, a lack of intimacy. If you didn't have the inclination to make use of the many available resources, you were left to your own devices to relieve the tension. Archie would tease me whenever I was in a bad mood, laughing at me and calling me a frustrated old woman whenever he saw me being irritable. Thankfully, he had ways and means. The only female in the prison was the governor's secretary, a plain, chunky woman in her 50s who the inmates only ever saw if they were summoned to the old man's office. She wasn't unattractive, just plain and dull in a matronly way. However, what she was someone who had been unhappy in her marriage for years and sought out attention to fulfill her desires. Christine was made available to me at least once a month. Once I started working for Billy, I would be summoned to the governor's office on some pretext or other, only to find that he was out golfing or whatever, and instead find her there. She was open to various encounters and seemed to enjoy them immensely. She preferred a more intense experience and was always eager for more. She often mentioned that being compensated for these encounters was a fantasy of hers, which made her happy to help those of us who had access to her. Pregnancy wasn't an issue for her. She was past that stage. Health concerns were not a factor at the time, allowing her to maintain her personal life without worry. After one of these encounters, she would return home and enjoy dinner with her husband, as if nothing had happened. In prison, inmates came and went, sentences finished, and new convicts arrived constantly. Eventually, it was time for my mate Archie to leave. We parted with a promise from him that he would keep in touch, and that if I ever needed anything, he was there for me. I had no other friends by then, as my family lived too far away to make regular visits. Archie had been my rock, the only person I could really talk to, and I had come to rely on him in a way I used to with my sisters. When he was released, he left a huge void in my life. He kept his promise. I received letters from him at least once a week, updating me on his life, although we both knew our letters were read by the guards before reaching us. He tried to visit me too, but it wasn't allowed by the authorities. It would break his parole conditions if he associated with other convicted criminals. Instead, we chatted on the phone once a month, which always cheered me up. Because of my association with MCV, I was allowed a single cell after Archie had been released. I must say, having no one to talk to and laugh with after lights out was the loneliest I ever felt during my time there. I missed him a lot. Being locked away from your family places an unbearable strain on your loved ones and can bring devastating consequences. Mine were no exception. My father died a couple of years after I had been locked up, taken by a surprise heart attack. It really was a surprise. He had always been a fit, strong man, but the stress of his only son being incarcerated for 20 years took its toll on him. My mother then died within 12 months of Dad, of a broken heart. My sister always said, leaving me with just my much older siblings. My nieces and nephew didn't really want to know about me. They blamed me wholly for the loss of their beloved grandparents, something I totally understood. I blamed myself too. By the time I was released on parole, 20 years to the day after I had first been incarcerated, one of my sisters had passed away as well, and the other had simply stopped keeping in touch. Her return letters to me had gradually dried up until I eventually had no idea what had happened to her. I was a single man in my late 40s with no usable skills, no family to speak of, and no place I could still call home. I was in a difficult situation. That's when Archie showed what a true friend he really was. He met me at the prison gates and took me to a really posh hotel where we were met by two beautiful women. It wouldn't have mattered to me at that time if they had been elderly. They were stunning. Jenny and Annie were completely different physically. One was tall and slim with long legs that seemed to go on forever and a face that could belong on a magazine cover. The other was much shorter and thicker set with a soft, curvy figure. She had a lovely natural face and a smile that lit up the room. I couldn't tell you now who was who. It was such a long time ago, and the pair of them did tend to merge in my subconscious during the 2 days we were together. What I can say, though, is that unquestionably they were both absolutely stunningly beautiful in their different ways, and they kept me on my toes. They were only the fourth and fifth women I had the chance to be with, and they were undeniably the most captivating and alluring individuals I had met in my life. They took everything I had to offer and still wanted more, leaving me feeling drained after years of longing. I was still extremely fit back then, thanks to my exercise regime in prison, ensuring I was a lean, muscular man. I got the impression the two girls enjoyed themselves almost as much as I did, and I still look back fondly on those wonderfully exhausting days and nights we spent together, laughing, enjoying exquisite food, and drinking good champagne, all from room service and paid for by Archie. Eventually, I ran out of steam, feeling a deep sense of appreciation for my two charming companions. They finally left me, giggling away together like two mischievous schoolgirls as they walked arm in arm down the hotel corridor. Over dinner in the hotel restaurant with Archie that night, I was dressed in the expensive suit and shoes my mate had supplied me with. I finally got around to asking him where all the money was coming from. I queried whether he had returned to his previous ways, despite assuring me when he was released that he would never again give the authorities the opportunity to lock him up. "Not at all, mate," he laughed in his Cockney twang. "I finally did as you suggested, that's all." What did I suggest? Remind me, I asked, puzzled about what I had ever said to him that would have resulted in him going straight and still having the money to lavish on me the way he had been doing. Well, you remember the time we were laughing about some of the things I had done, and you joked that if I had spent as much time and effort doing lawful painting, I would be rich and, more importantly, free by then? Well, that's what I did. I started painting properly, and for some unknown reason, people wanted to buy my stuff. Really? That's terrific. I still don't understand how you can afford all this, though, I replied, gesturing around us at our lavish surroundings. My slightly drunk mate laughed loudly, almost falling off his chair as the rest of the diners looked on in amusement. You really are such a wanker, he giggled, loud enough to cause the whole dining room to look in our direction. If you ever read anything other than the sports pages, you'd know who I am. I looked at him quizzically, totally bemused by my best friend in the whole world, who had obviously gone completely off his rocker. Just then, the maitre d' approached our table and inquired softly, "Is everything satisfactory, Mr. Squires?" Laughing loudly, Archie turned to the man. "Yes, thank you, George. I'm sorry for the disturbance. I'm just with a very good friend I haven't seen for a long time, and I'm afraid I'm a little drunk. Please pass my apologies to your other patrons." "No problem at all, Mr. Squires. Have a good evening," the smoothly efficient man said as he efficiently pocketed the 50-pound note Archie had slipped into his hand. "I still don't understand, mate. Just how do you come to have so much money?" I asked before draining the last of my champagne. Just then, a lovely-looking young girl of about 15 approached our table, tentatively inquiring softly, "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Squires, but would you mind signing this for me?" She offered her pristine cotton napkin to my friend. "Not at all, my dear," the one-time master forger replied, smiling and taking a pen from his inside pocket. I had never seen Archie look so happy as he continued chatting to the pretty girl, asking her name and establishing that she wanted to be an artist herself while drawing a small caricature of her face on the white cloth. He then signed and dedicated it to her beneath the sketch, returning the cloth with a grin on his face as wide as the Thames. "Oh my God, thank you so much. I really love your work." Thank you so very much," the overwhelmed young girl stammered before she quickly returned to her table, excitedly showing her souvenir to her amused parents. "Come on, let's adjourn to the lounge," my host laughed, draining the rest of the very expensive wine as though it was lemonade. As we passed the young girl's family's table, her father stood and shook hands warmly with the grinning ex-con, saying quietly, "Thank you so much, Mr. Squires. It's my little girl's 16th birthday today, and you have just made it one she will never forget. Thank you once again." Taking the young girl's hand in his, Archie bent at the waist, and his voice, only slightly affected by the vast quantity of wine he had drunk, said directly to his new #1 admirer, "Amanda, it was my great pleasure, my dear. I wish you a happy birthday and hope you have many more in a long and prosperous life." He then kissed the girl's shaking hand, slapped her dad on the back, and swept me out of the dining room to a gentle ripple of applause from the rest of the enthralled diners. "I gather I am missing something here," I said after we had 2 extremely large Napoleon brandies delivered by a fawning waitress. She was obviously delighted with the 20-pound Archie insisted she take, almost curtsying as she left us alone once again in the otherwise empty lounge bar. "Oh, you think so, do you?" Archie giggled drunkenly. "I think you may be right, my young friend." He had always called me his young friend, even though he was only a few years older than me, and even though I was well into my mid-40s by then, he continued doing so in the full mischievous knowledge that it annoyed me. "So, you tosspot," I laughed, "explain yourself." Sitting back into the deep, soft leather Chesterfield, he grinned at me and said jokingly, "Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin." After dodging the cushion I had thrown at him, my only real friend in the world went on to explain what had happened to him since his release from prison. It turned out that after his release, he had decided to use his God-given talent for drawing and painting in the more legal pursuit of original portraiture. He started by painting whoever he could persuade to pose for nothing, selling those small offerings at a market stall he ran on weekends. He then progressed to figure studies of various ladies who happened to be sharing his space at the time. One of these temporary companions just so happened to be the best friend of the daughter of one of the most prominent art critics of the age, and the girl in question was so impressed by the depth and quality of Archie's work that she insisted on showing her father the rather revealing painting of her friend. This critic had instantly raved about Archie's work, demanding that his daughter introduce him to the man who had painted such a stunning piece. It didn't take long after that first meeting between painter and critic for Archie's reputation as a bona fide artist to start to spread. It all kicked off when another critic, the art correspondent for the Sunday Times, no less, saw some of Archie's paintings and described him rather pretentiously in his column as the best new portrait artist to appear in this country for hundreds of years. After that, because of the two critic standings in the art community, Archie's reputation as an artist, and consequently the demand for his work, skyrocketed. His paintings sold as soon as they were finished. Collectors from all over the world clamored to get their hands on them, hoping and anticipating that their value would increase dramatically. In the midst of all that, Archie unashamedly used his newfound celebrity to attract women of such beauty they would not have given him a second glance if it wasn't for his fame. He never hid the fact he was an ex-forger. Instead, he reveled in it, exploiting the notoriety it brought him to aid his dedicated pursuit of the most beautiful companions he could find. I was staggered. My friend, the one I had spent 7 years locked up with, was now a world-famous celebrity artist, known and respected wherever he went, loaded and with access to beautiful models, and the like who would do anything to be the subject of his next work. I couldn't believe it. Hell, mate, I gasped in open-mouthed bewilderment after he had finally finished telling me about how much his life had changed. I mean, just how rich are you? How long? I had no idea. Archie laughed loudly at my astonishment, waving to the young waitress and asking her to bring us the whole bottle of brandy instead of another measure. Well, let's just say the last painting I sold, a figure study of an American billionaire's trophy wife no less, went for £350,000. So yes, I do rather well out of them, he affirmed, chuckling away in his amusement as he poured us both huge measures of £500 bottle French brandy. Wow, that's terrific. I mean, I'm so glad you're making a good living. You must have to paint a lot, though, to afford all this, I replied, spreading my arms to indicate our plush surroundings, my admiration for my friend expanding even more. Archie looked at me quizzically. Slowly, a smile of realization crossed his face before he burst into peals of laughter once again. £350,000, you pillock, he chortled, downing his drink in one go. Hell, mate, I thought, all my befuddled mind could come up with to say. The story continues in the next video. Link to part 2 in the description of this video. Thank you for watching and for your likes.